Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's book club. I am so excited to be joined by XiXi, who is the author of This Place is Still Beautiful, the amazing book that we have been reading for the month of September. Just in case you don't know how this works, if you've suddenly stumbled upon this live stream and you're like, who are these people? What's a book club? We are the platform YA Book Club. Every single month we read a book by a different YA author, and then we get to talk to them at the end of the month. If you want to join, the link is in the description for the Discord, where we chat about the book as we go along, and then also drop in questions for the author. So I have a bunch of questions that our readers have already submitted, but if you have joined us live and would like to ask questions, please do put them in the chat. I will be monitoring it, so I will not miss them. I can see already that we've got a few people who have joined and are saying hi in the chat. Hello, hello. I am pretty sure that both of you have questions that I know you've asked on the Discord, so we will be getting to them very shortly. So the first things first, in case there is anyone who has jumped on this call and is like, I just joined this live stream. I don't know what this book is. Tell us a little bit about it in your own words as the author. How would you sort of describe This Place is Still Beautiful to potential readers?
Thank you so much, first of all, for anyone who's joining or watching later on. My book is called This Place is Still Beautiful, and it is set in the American Midwest in Illinois. And it's essentially about two sisters. They're biracial, Chinese American, and their house gets they're very different sisters. So as the setup is like, there's an older sister who is like sort of like got classic older sibling vibes. She is a high achiever, she's very outspoken, and then she has like a younger sister who's like very much more like go with the flow, listens to what her parents tell her. She like doesn't want to stick her head out too much. And their house in the Midwest gets vandalized with a racial slur. Specifically, someone spray paints the word chinks on their garage door. And that sort of brings both sisters back home, because the older sister, Margaret, has been going to college and is at an internship in New York City. So she comes back home, and they spend the summer together in the house. And it's sort of dealing with the fallout of this particular situation, and like both emotionally and also just trying to figure out who the perpetrator is, because one sister, the older one, Margaret, is very committed to finding out who did it, bringing that person to justice. And the younger sister, Annalie, this is very much not how she expected to spend her summer. She's always like felt very comfortable in her community, versus Margaret, who's always felt like a little bit left out. Also, in particular, like Annalie has always been white passing, and Margaret's not been white passing, so that kind of like feeds into their experience in the community. And so, yeah, the two sisters end up like butting heads, and it's sort of about how their relationship develops over the course of the summer. Also, like there's a little bit of romance in there, but like that's generally the setup for how the book kicks off.
Amazing. So I thought I would start with a question from one of the readers. This is from Dark Gus, who I think might be watching. I hope I pronounced that right. Have you ever yourself had a difficult or tough experience like your characters do in the book when they find this racial slur on their house? Was this something that was inspired by your experiences specifically?
So I've never had my house be vandalized with a racial slur, which I think would be very scarring. Just like the whole like red scarlet letter element of it, like the shame of like it being out there in public for like a long period of time, where you'd have to sort of like get rid of it and like hide it. And I think that would be very traumatic. That has not happened to me. I have like definitely had lots of experiences in my life where like people have made various comments about me, either overt or like in a benign way. So there have been like aggressive overt comments where, once when I was in college, I was like standing there at a bus stop, just like minding my own business. And like this woman walked by me and called me an ugly chink, and then just kept going, which was like really out of the blue. Like, in that moment, I kind of like didn't even react to it, because I was like, did that just happen? Like, did that just happen? Like, I don't even know you. You literally just walked by. And like, it was so jarring that I like, it was almost funny, but then also like kind of traumatizing because I was like, what the hell? Like, it's so crazy. So there's been like really overt stuff like that. And then there's been some of the more sort of like microaggressive comments where it's like, where are you really from? Or like, I think just one example that just comes to mind is, I went to the opera with my parents-in-law, and like I was in the bathroom with my mother-in-law, and some woman made like a comment about how she was like, oh, like, I love your dress. She was like, I used to live in Shanghai, and I just like loved like the clothing there. Like, it's so great that you get to wear Western style clothing in the US. Or it's like, it was very like a weird comment where I was just like, what? Like, it obviously wasn't coming from a place of hatred, I guess, but more of a place of like othering and like exoticism, where I was just like, look, I'm just like an American person like in the bathroom trying to pee and like mind my own business and watch this opera. Like, I didn't ask for you to like make a bunch of comments about China and stuff, like stuff like that. So I think there's like sort of been a spectrum, but I definitely channeled like a lot of my feelings about all of these sort of interactions into the characters in the book.
Yeah, I think that it definitely comes across as a lot of instances that both of the sisters have around both like microaggressions, but also just aggressions. And one of the things that I think is really exciting is when you get a book with a dual POV with two very different points of view. And right from the beginning, we have these two characters talking about each other and what they think their sister sees when they look at them. And that came across both in how they think about themselves and their family, but also how they react to these instances of racism that go on around them. I didn't say at the beginning, but just in case anyone's listening who doesn't know at this point, for the first part of this, we're going to be doing a non-spoiler based stream. So if you haven't quite finished the book yet, don't worry, you can keep watching till about halfway when we'll go into spoiler territory, because there'll be a lot to talk about, stuff that's later in the book. So I will let you know, you can pause and come back to it later, but just thought it was worth saying just before we dive properly in. So you talked a bit about this kind of being part of the inspiration. What else drew you to this story? Was it something that just came into your head fully formed, or has it been something that you've been working on for a long time that's like slowly made its way into the book that it's become?
Yes, that's a great question. There's like a lot of elements of the book I think that like came from different places. So I started writing this book in 2017. It was like shortly after, I want to say it was like winter, shortly after the 2016 election in the United States, which I think a lot of people would say was like a really shocking and like crazy time. It happened, like, really did not expect it to go down the way that it did. And also I think after it happened, I had just finished writing a previous book and had queried it, had not gotten an agent. So I was like about to embark on like a new project and was like trying to figure out like, what do I want to write next? So like election happened. I was like I was having a real personal fallout with that situation because I kind of felt like the outcome was so unexpected, and it felt like, there were a lot of racist comments that were made during the course of the election. And like, I think afterward, when you found out how widespread and how many people had voted for Trump, even though and there was sort of like I would say like kind of like denial about the situation where people would be like, well, like, he's problematic in all of these like different ways, but that's not why I voted for him. Like, I voted for him because like I agree with his economic policy or like whatever. But he was like a very much more aggressive about his like outward racist comments than like other candidates had been in the past, I would say. And I kind of felt like this sense of like almost like surrealism in being in America at that point, because I immigrated to the United States when I was young, grew up here, very much consider myself an American, very proud of my immigrant past and upbringing, but like felt like comfortable in my community and felt like I belonged most of the time. Like, stuff happens, but like most of the time I felt quite like this is my home. But then all of a sudden I felt like I was put in this situation where other people were thought of me as other, and that as like almost like lesser, in that they were okay with somebody who was so like vocally repugnant toward minority groups, and they were just like, well, that's not as important as all these other issues that I care about. And I kind of felt like it was like in the back of your mind you were wondering, oh, did people always feel this way? They just like didn't vocalize it. And like I guess I just didn't know Americans as well as I thought that I did. Like I didn't think that Americans around me thought this way, but it turns out a lot of them do because they voted for this guy. And so that experience of suddenly feeling like really feeling like a foreigner when I hadn't before triggered, I think, the idea of this story of growing up somewhere where you feel very familiar and comfortable, but then suddenly being thrust into this circumstance where you're like, oh, I don't actually know this place at all, and I don't know these people around me, and I didn't know that they were capable of doing all these things. One of the titles that I had originally come up with for the book that did not end up being the title was These Strange Places, which was kind of how I felt, was like suddenly I was in this strange place that I always thought was my home. So that's sort of what was one of the reasons that I started writing this particular story. I also just like really liked the idea. I don't have a sister personally, but I love stories with sister relationships and generally sibling relationships, because I have a sibling and we have like we had kind of a similar relationship, even though he was not my sister growing up, of like loving each other but not liking each other very much because we were just in this family. So obviously we love each other, but like we were so different that if we weren't related, we would never talk to each other and we'd never be friends. And I wanted to portray that dynamic in a story and like how you sort of like navigate that relationship and a little bit of the guilt that they kind of feel inside about being like, I feel like I should like know you and like you more because we're related, but like I don't, and you're supposed to be like the closest relationship I have, but we're not really. So I wanted that to be in the story. And then also just it's set in the American Midwest because that's where I grew up, and I have not lived there in many years. I moved away after I went to law school to the East Coast, which is where I live now today. And I kind of had like a little bit of that nostalgia, wanted to like portray that setting in the way that I remembered it in sort of this like goldenish childhood idea and like the idea of growing away from it. So all of that kind of fed into this story as it ultimately came out.
Amazing. During the answer, you actually answered one of Pippin's questions. He's asked a couple, so I'll ask another one of them. So they've asked, Annalie and Margaret had very different reactions and ways of dealing with what happens to them. Which of the two are you more like? And then they said, I'm 100% an Annalie.
Yeah, people always ask me that question, and I think it's really interesting to see who people say that they identify with more, because I've both seen reactions where people are like, I can't understand Annalie, she's such a freaking doormat. Like, what, like, why does it take her so long to like come to terms with like all this stuff that's happening? And then there are other people who are like, Margaret's really annoying and abrasive, and like I feel like I don't like her. So I think it says a lot about who you are depending on who you identify with. And definitely I wrote these two characters as sort of two different sides of myself, because I think that depending on the day and depending on, you know, my circumstances, I will react in a very Margaret way or an Annalie way, and it just depends, you know. Or sometimes I am an Annalie and I like wish I was more of a Margaret. I think like overall, I probably come down more on the side of Annalie. Her part of the story was much easier for me to write, and Margaret's side of the story actually took a lot more revisions because I was not able to tap into her as easily as I was able to tap into Annalie. Like Annalie's sort of internal insecurity in high school and her like wanting to be like liked by everyone, this like people pleaser personality that she has, was something that I both identify more with today and also definitely identify more with in high school. So it was easier for me to write, for sure.
Amazing. I'd love to hear in that case, because it's that sounds really interesting about like there being a split, kind of you being a split between the characters, because I feel like when we ask authors about this, and it comes up quite often, they often have like one particular character that they're like, oh, this is me. Yeah, I'm totally this one. So I was wondering if you talk a bit about the process behind creating your characters, if it's like always very similar, or if you kind of find characters come to you in different ways.
I think it's really different for every book. But for this one, I think that one thing that I tend to do, which I think I've done for most, if not all of my books, which may seem kind of silly, but I always like look at the Myers-Briggs personality breakdowns before I start writing a character. And I try to assign a Myers-Briggs personality to each of the characters so that I kind of like am reminded of like what their traits are and like think about how they would react to certain situations based on like the type of personality that they are. I also just like really like personality tests. Not that I like buy into them like scripture, but I think that they're so interesting. And I love taking them, and I feel like I've taken like a bunch of them. So I like doing that for my characters. And I cannot remember who I like what I assigned to Margaret and what I assigned to Annalie. It's like in one of my notebooks somewhere. But I remember doing that, and that helped me sort of flesh things out, because I think that it's the way that a character's personality develops, at least in my writing, comes through the process of writing that first draft. Is so part of the way is like I have an idea of what their personality is, and their personality sort of informs how the events of the book are going to break down based on how their reactions to things. But then also, as I'm sort of like just drafting and getting that story down, I think that the way that the narrative arc turns out also refines like their personality in later drafts. So I kind of have to discover their personality a little bit as I'm writing as well, which is definitely what happened with Margaret, which is like I started in one place and I was really sort of like struggling to figure out how to really get her down on paper, and it took like a few drafts to get there.
Amazing. Had some comments in from people saying that's a really cool way to build a character. Yeah, I love that. As someone who also loves to take personality tests, even if I don't think they're real, that sounds like a perfect way of doing it for me. And also has said I completely saw where Margaret was coming from, but I didn't like how she went about it, which I think is always really interesting when you've got kind of characters that make these difficult decisions. This is a question we ask all our authors, because I am the one interviewing you and I get to ask questions, and I like this question. And it always throws up some really interesting answers, which is, if you could write something, whether it's just like a little bonus chapter or short story, or even like another book, from the point of view of one of the characters that you didn't write the point of view of in this book, do you have one that you like would love to like dig into their head and like see what's going on with them?
That's a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that question. But I think that the answer would be Mama, the mother character. I actually, in initial drafts, thought about inserting certain chapters from her perspective, because she is like comes from like a very different background from the two girls, a totally different country, and like obviously went through a whole life before she even had the daughters. And her reaction to what happens to the house is also pretty different and informed by her experience in that community as well. And so I really wanted to like get that in there, but it was just like too much stuff. And like she is like obviously a totally different age range, and so it didn't like ultimately pan out. But I think that she is the point of view character. It would have been very cool to be able to like have certain chapters with her perspective in them.
I agree. I feel like I could read like a prequel of her and like what was going on with her in there, and we'll talk a bit more about in the spoiler section, but the girl's dad and whatever it was that happened back then. I would love to talk a little bit more about your kind of inspiration for stuff, because I always find it so fascinating about how authors kind of get their inspiration, but also like keep their inspiration while they're writing and don't sort of just get completely burnt out by trying to like dig through and edit and do all the drafts and everything. Did you find there was anything that was like useful for you while you were doing it? Like, were you reading at the same time? Or are you the kind of writer who's like, keep me away from other books, I don't want to be comparing myself to what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, like, different people have different writing processes. I know that some writers are like really fast and they just like get it all down on paper, and then, like then the editing process is like good for them and they can like figure out where the story goes. I'm a very slow writer. Like, I think I'm not one of those people who can just like get a book down in like a couple months. So I'm writing it over the course of like multiple years, particularly this one because there was also like no time pressure. So I just kind of like wrote it when I had time to write it. Like I said, I started writing it in 2017 and I sold it in 2020. So like, yeah, 3 years worth of writing time for that book. And I do fall in and out of interest of the story while I'm writing. I think that the one thing that I find helpful, because it's always really hard to keep writing when you're like, oh, this is garbage and I don't feel like connected to what I'm doing right now. And I feel like I'm just gonna have to throw this all out later, is reading. So I am definitely one of those people who just like tries to read while I'm writing. I think that there's something about like the way that I think reading like gets your brain going, where even I'm not like trying, I'm very bad at like plotting when I'm like actually like actively trying to think, oh, like what's going to happen next, like what do I want in this story. But there's, I think like in your subconscious your brain is like sort of working on things while you're not actually writing. And reading is for me one of those like great Kickstarter activities that I think gets the neurons firing in the brain to start doing some of that work. I always find that when I read like really good books, I feel refreshed and like inspired to like get back into writing. Whereas like if I haven't read for a while, I just like look at the page and I'm like, why am I doing this? Like this is awful. so yeah, I'm always in search of like really great reads while I'm writing.
I love that. I feel like that's quite unusual. Most authors that we talk to are like, get those books away from me. But I really relate to you, because when they say that, I'm like, I would just never read. I would like, it would take me so long to write stuff. I'd be like, I guess I'll never pick up a book
I mean,
again.
if I didn't read while I was writing, I'd be like, there would just be that I would just never read, because like it takes me so long to get through a book.
I love that in the chat, when we asked the question about what other character would you like to see from, people were like, oh, I'd read that around Mama, but they then also Pippin has put in a hard request for a Daniel situation. I think that Daniel was a big people were fans of old Dan, which fair
I
enough.
think that's amazing, because again, I am not at all from the UK or know anybody really like from the UK other than like work colleagues. So like I'm glad that like people read it and were like, yeah, he's cool, and not like, wow, this is like a huge butchering of like my culture. And
how could you? No, it was great. I love a bit of Dan, and again, we will talk about him later. Not that I'm like really teasing for everyone who like won't get to listen to the spoiler section yet, but I am teasing you and gently encouraging you to finish the book. Pressure. So let's take another question from the readers. This is kind of an interesting one from Dark Gus, who asks, do you remember the first time you saw yourself represented? I guess whether that's in a book or in like movies or TV or anything like that.
yeah, I guess I'll like specifically talk about in books, because that's why we're all here. And yeah, when I was younger, there was definitely like definitely less like Asian American representation in YA fiction. And I'm trying to remember, like, I feel like I didn't read that many books featuring Asian characters when I was in my formative years. So the ones that I did read like stand out a lot, because I was a big reader, but like there just weren't that many books. So you know, so I remember reading, like, I feel like all of these books are out of print at this point, like, so, and no one is going to know what they are. But I remember reading, like, there was a book that I read, I think in like junior high or elementary school. It was called like Chinese Cinderella. And it was actually like a memoir about growing up in China, which was really great. And I read this, I read, The Fold by, I want to say like, I do not remember what the author's name is. I'm actually gonna like look it up right now, because it's by Ann Na. Okay, I thought it was by Ann Na, but I was like, I can't remember. Like maybe I'm just like making up the author's name. And it was about like this girl. She's actually Korean, and she was debating between like getting eyelid surgery, because that was like a thing that was like very common in her community and in her family at the time. And she was like trying to come to terms with like getting this feedback that like her eyes weren't like what people considered beautiful, but then also changing like a part of her body and stuff like that. And even though I'm not Korean, like it was just, I felt it was so interesting to read that book, because I am also monolidded. I never had any real like desire to change my eyelids or anything, but it was such like an Asian American specific issue about like getting the eyelid surgery that I thought it was really cool. And then there was a book called Seeing Emily by Joyce Lee Wong, which is definitely out of print. I think I looked it up on Goodreads and had like 50 reviews or something, and like no one's read it. And it's a novel in verse, but that book really stands out to me because it was about a Chinese American girl who was growing up, and her family owned a restaurant. My family does not own a restaurant, but like I know lots of people whose families do own Chinese restaurants. And she was just going, it's like a sort of slice of life novel where she is going to high school. She's dating this guy who she's really excited because he's like her first boyfriend, but he's also white and he kind of like exoticizes her in a lot of ways. There's like sort of like that yellow fever-esque phenomenon, and she's like trying to figure out like, does he really like me for me, or does he like me because he just like thinks that he's like dating some like geisha girl or whatever. And like I feel like those were all things that I grappled with when I was like in high school, especially like dating in America, mostly in a white town. And that I just thought that book just really spoke to me, because I don't think that I had read a book until then that was like about someone who was like so demographically similar to me. And it was amazing. I found it like in the library, like just went to the YA section, like happened to be on the shelf. And I felt so seen by that book. And I feel like reading that book was when I first actually actively thought about the issue of like, there's not a lot of books about Asian Americans out there, because I just didn't really think about it. I think like, because the media was just so white at that time that I didn't like really think about representation as an issue until I read something and I was like, oh wow, this book is like really like speaks to me, is like about me. And I thought that was so cool. And I think it's great that nowadays there's so many more books of like all different types of people that like teens can find stories that speak to them more deeply, rather than just like reading the same like a boy and his dog book and like girl, like, you know, like white girl going through her life, whatever. Like it's great that those books exist. It's not that that's a bad thing, but like I think that now there's like such a big range, and I hope that continues to be something that publishing takes very seriously.
Absolutely. I'm like realize, so not to pull back the curtain, but my laptop is currently on a stack of books. And even just looking at these, it's like the first one is Aurora Rising, which is like a YA sci-fi where one of the lead characters is an Asian girl who like, but it's sci-fi, so it's like, the very relatable experience of her waking up on a spaceship hundreds of years after she like first made her journey as the last of humankind. And I'm like, very, very relatable stuff. But there's like a bunch of things that are like new releases, which is so exciting. I can see down here there's also a kind of Christmas rom-com with a disabled queer like protagonist. So I totally get what you mean. And I also, so anyone who's watched any of the videos on the platform channel will probably be familiar with my friend Tasmin, who has hosted some of the videos, who is herself biracial. She's half Chinese, half white, and she is writing something about two biracial sisters. And so as soon as I was like 10 pages into this, I was like, there are so many things that we've talked about that you talk about within this book that feel like such authentic experiences, which are put in a way that feels so organic and so truthful, whether that is, and also feel like issues within a community rather than issues outside of a community. So I think that we're used to having kind of stories which are about racism, but it's always kind of like, and there is this side and that side, and there's not necessarily a lot of nuance that goes into the idea of like, what is it like to be two sisters, one of which is very white passing and one of which isn't, and like what experiences might be slightly different for them growing up, even though they're in the same household. Like how kind of reminded me when you were talking about the idea of like eyelid surgery, you have the idea of like, even our eyes are different as these two sisters, and that has potentially dictated how we're able to go through the world. And again, I feel like I keep being like, and we'll come to it later, because there are some interesting scenes where that gets confronted. But was that something that you were really conscious of showing a real breadth of experience of kind of these Asian American characters, rather than it being kind of like a monolithic, like, okay, and now we are going to have this, like, I guess, ironically, model minority idea of like, this is the character who's standing up against racism, and it's like a very black and white issue?
Yeah, I really specifically wanted to show sort of like the range of reactions that people have, and that like Asian Americans have a lot of like internal conflict, honestly, about how to deal with racism. We sort of in conversations about race in America, there's always sort of like this feeling of like being in between, because we're like especially when people are talking about like white people and black people in particular, like because Asian Americans have so frequently been pitted against black people as part of like the like white supremacist structure, in terms of being like, oh, like with the model minority stereotype of being like, here's like a minority that's like very successful, and like if everyone just applied themselves more, then like they would just be fine, and like systemic racism is not a thing, and you know, like if these people can do it, then like you can do it too, and like very much like flattening it, and you know, conquering and dividing, I think, between people of color and their common experiences and the way that they can sort of relate to each other. And I think like particularly with immigrants that come to the United States, like my parents' generation, for instance, like they always have this like vibe of like the nail that sticks out the most like gets hit with the hammer, whatever the proverb is. Like there's just like very much this like pressure to like fit in and like be like follow these like safe paths and like be and conform and like be, you know, find success in this particular way, because they sacrifice so much to come to the United States, and they're like, it's not worth it for us to, you know, be those, to be very outspoken. And like culturally growing up, like it's just it's almost like a cultural thing of like being told to just keep your head down, work hard, you'll be rewarded, blah blah blah. But then like I think as I've gotten older, and especially since I've like joined corporate America and stuff, like you notice stuff like, oh, like there's not very many Asians in leadership, because like it's always your fault because you don't like speak up and like ask for promotions, and you just think that like if you just do your work, then you know people will notice what a great workhorse you are, and they'll just like promote you. And then you realize that that's not really the case. There's very few Asian Americans who are in politics, because it's like not one of those like safe prescribed routes, and like Asian Americans don't like speaking up about like various issues. And I think that like a lot of that like internal conflict happens within the community. And I wanted to sort of like reflect that in Annalie and Margaret, who have these like very different perspectives, and not necessarily wrong perspectives. Like they're informed by how they've experienced moving through society in this community. And it's just very painful for them because they happen to be affected by the same thing, and they're like in the same family. But you know, people can react to these things in different ways. And that I wanted readers to like sort of see that through the characters.
Amazing. I would love to have a little chat about the kind of your experience as a writer, because I know that we've got some people in the book club who are aspiring writers themselves, or just readers who are just excited about what goes on behind the scenes, as it were. Are you someone who is much more of like a plotting person, like you get everything perfect before you start writing, or is it much more go with the flow, or do you find that it kind of depends on what you're writing, particular scenes or particular books, it might be different for you?
For me, it is the latter too. So I'm definitely not like a plotter. I don't like plotting. I'm not one of those people who comes up with like very intense outlines. And I didn't have an outline for this book. Like I wrote it and I just wrote from beginning to end. I'm also very bad at writing out of order. So I just had to have to power through whatever crappy part I'm writing so that I can get to something that is better later. Um, and for me, the drafting process is like a little bit of the discovery process. I will say that when I start writing a book, I typically have a good sense of like how the book is going to start, some major plot points in the middle, and then like how the book is going to end. And I don't write those down, but like I have them in my head as I'm writing. But it for better or worse, that process does not work for every book. Like I'm working on my second book right now, and I started drafting. I think I got like 50,000 words in. Then I sent it to my agent, and she was like, "This is not working for you." So she's like, "Here are all the things that are not working about this draft right now," because I was stuck. And she was like, "Here are all the things that you should fix." And I was like, "Oh yeah, actually that would make the plot better." So then I went back to the beginning, and I actually created an outline, not a very good one. Like I'm still not like a detailed outliner, but I was like, here's what's going to happen in this chapter, 3 bullet points. Here's what's going to happen in this chapter, 3 bullet points. And I did that for the whole book. And then I started from scratch and started redrafting again. And now I'm like most of the way through that draft now. That one just like needed a little bit more structure because I was just like struggling in the middle to like connect all the dots and figure out what the important emotional beats were. So I think it does depend on every book. Maybe for the next one, I'll be like, no, I actually need like an extremely detailed outline to get through this book. And I think it depends on the story. So I'm open to like be changing my ways. But I do hate outlining. Like even if I have to do it, I hate it.
Do you have any advice that you would give to any readers out there who are pursuing writing, either stuff that you've like figured out moving forward, like now you're published, like on a practical level, or more of a, you know, wishy-washy emotional advice I will also accept?
Yeah, I feel like this is advice that everyone gives, but it's truly the only advice that matters, is just that you have to keep writing. Like you have to keep doing it. Like I wrote 6 books maybe before I got this one agented and sold. And if I had stopped at any one of those points, then obviously would not have gotten to this book. And I always felt like I was writing because I wanted to, and not because I did want to get published, but I really just like the process of writing, and therefore like I kept writing. And now that I am published, it's a whole different set of emotions, because like tying your art to capitalism is like a different experience. And you kind of like start fixating on like sales and like, what is my next step in my career is going to be, like, what is it good? There's so many more cooks in the kitchen at that point. And now I have to like remind myself to keep writing, and like that the thing that brought me to this point, which is writing because I enjoy it, is a thing that should continue to carry me forward, and not all of these other elements that are now sort of just like floating in the ether of my brain, because there's so little control you have over anything in this industry, just no control whatsoever. That the only thing you can have control over is like do what you enjoy doing, and if that's writing, then keep writing. And if you don't enjoy it, then like don't do it. Like, you know, don't do it because you want to like get published, or because you want like to be famous or whatever. Like just write because you enjoy writing. And if you keep writing, the only way that you can like fail at being a writer is if you like just stop writing. Like so keep writing, and you know, it will work itself out, I think, if you just keep pushing forward.
I love that. We have reached the part of the live stream where we are going to be digging into spoiler territory. Sirens, klaxons, let's go. So for anyone who hasn't quite finished yet, now is your time to pause. And while I'm giving you time to pause, we will ask the sort of transfer over question, which is almost always the same, because Pippin asks it every single time, which is sequel ? And then has added the caveat, I'd love more of Daniel.
So there's not a sequel, unfortunately, but there is going to be another book that I am publishing at some point. I don't know yet, because I have not turned in the draft, but the draft is almost done. And I told my publisher that I'm turning it in October, which I realize is next month. It may be November, but I am very close to finishing it. And this next book is about this girl whose brother has died, and her family is holding this like crazy secret. It's kind of like The Farewell. I don't know if people have like watched the movie The Farewell, where they don't tell the grandma that she is dying of terminal cancer. But this girl, she's Chinese American, and her grandmother is in China, and her grandmother raised her and her brother for some period of time before she came to the United States to join her parents, which is actually a thing that I know other Asian Americans where that has happened. Their parents immigrated first, got everything established in the United States, kids stayed in China, and then came back over when everything was sort of like more settled. And so her grandmother raised them. Her brother has passed away. Her grandmother is in very ill health. So her parents have decided not to tell the grandmother that her brother has passed away. And so they are holding this like big burdensome secret. She's going to go to China because her grandmother's in ill health, and they're going to go see her. And before she does that, she is going on a college road trip because it is the summer before she applies for college. So a family friend who has a boy who's her age, who's a childhood friend of hers and her brother's, is sort of like taking her on a trip of in-state colleges in California. And she's sort of like grappling with this like big family secret and all the things that her family has never talked about with respect to her brother's death. And it's an exploration of like the secrets that you keep in your own family. And Chinese Americans, at least in my experience and definitely in my own family, are like not big on talking about emotions. And a lot of times it gets very like pent up and like can create a lot of trauma if you're like not able to talk about things with the people who are closest to you in your life. And so it's sort of her coming to terms both with her brother's death and also trying to deal with like what's the right thing to do with her grandmother. So it's like a reverse farewell, I think. And so that book will come out at some point. I don't know what it's called. It's also untitled.
Yeah, it's super rude of you to be like, hey, here's the plot of a really amazing book. You're not going to get it for like at least a year. So I guess like I'm just getting
like, hyped up for it now.
Put it on the TBR. Amazing. Cool. So everyone who hasn't read the book will have left now. We can talk spoilers. Where do I begin? Let's go with, we haven't talked about the boys so much other than Daniel. So the boys, some of them, the boys. What I think was really exciting about this is that you had these kind of relationships between the sisters, between them and these different boys, their friends as well, and their careers, their schooling, like all this kind of stuff that really felt like it was connecting to this sort of transient life stage that they're both at, where they're like, does it make sense for me to continue this high school romance when I'm about to go to college? Does it like everything was kind of a little bit like, woo, was it always your intention for us to have these more ambiguous endings and to not necessarily have everything like neatly tied up with a bow, perfect, like contemporary romance style?
Yes, in the broader sense. So like one of the things that I really wanted to, we're in the spoiler section now. So like one of the things that I really wanted as part of the ending for this book is that I didn't, actually the original draft of the book I had, they did not actually find out who did the vandalism, which would have been obviously been
that was going to be one of my other questions. I love it. This is my favorite thing in the spoiler section, where the authors are like, here was what was going to happen in another draft. This is what we changed. This is what we love to see. Oh, that's so interesting.
It was originally not, I was going to be like, you didn't find out, because the big message I wanted to convey with the book, I don't know if it actually came across, was that like, you know, you don't get closure for some of these like big life events, that like the bad things happen and you have to like, and you deal with it. And then like, you have to find some way to move on. And in some ways you don't ever move on, but like in most of these cases, like, yeah, the cops aren't going to put in time and you are probably not going to figure out who it is. But then that turned out to be like a really boring story. It's like, you never found out like who did it. And like, there was no internal tension. And so like having Annalie find out that it was actually her boyfriend's friends, and he was covering for them, was like a big, like a much better story from like a plot perspective. But I did want it to end on an ambiguous note in terms of like, where do we go from here? I don't know, because like in many cases, stuff like this, it doesn't get prosecuted. Because why would it get prosecuted? Because it's not like, you know, the property damage is minimal and people don't want to like destroy these like upstanding boys' lives or whatever. And so do you hang on to that? Do you let go? Like, I don't know. So I wanted that to be sort of like an ambiguous thing. In terms of the romance, I think that like for Margaret and Rajiv, it was always going to be ambiguous. I mean, not ambiguous in that they do get back together, so you don't really know like how it's going to turn out from them. In my mind, like I think that they stay together, so they have like a pretty clear ending. For Daniel and Annalie, so actually there was a whole other chapter in the book that was written that I was forced to delete by my publisher, that is Annalie reuniting in New York with Daniel, and that's how the story was going to end, with them getting back together in New York. And I'm very partial to that chapter that got deleted, and it's in my drive somewhere. And I'm sad that it got deleted, but it made sense from a thematic perspective that we deleted it, because ultimately the story was about the sisters and them getting back together. So we ended it on the note that it did, which I think was the right answer. No, I know it's the right answer that we did delete it, but I did love writing them reuniting in New York, because like I just really liked them together. So
You as well. I was very stressed about Tom for basically the entire time, because not when he was very, very first introduced, but as soon as Daniel came along, I was like, one of these boys is going to mess up. And I don't think it's the one who was a bit grumpy at the beginning. I'm like, I'm feeling Tom's got something to do with this. And then I was like, oh God, he's going to be something to do with the graffiti, is going to be something to do with the hate crime. Oh God, it was very stressful. But also I'm very glad that she kicked him to the curb, because God, that boy. Were you, so I'm kind of interested in this, the draft of the idea of like not ever finding out who did it. Did you as the author always know that it was going to be like local boy, like these local boys who were at the school kind of thing? Or at that point were you also like, I don't know who did it, like no one knows?
I think I always had the sense that it was going to be like some local people doing some stuff, because, and I especially, I talked to like a different book club where they were like asking a lot of questions about the fact that the boys were drunk when they did it, and whether that was like an important detail. And it was an important detail to me, because I feel like there's a lot of question slash exoneration around when people do bad stuff when they're drunk, and like whether that's something that they like do with intention when they're drunk, or they don't do with intention when they're drunk, and whether the drunkenness like is a significant like a mitigating factor if that happens. Because in the story, Tom is like, we were drunk, like we did dumb stuff. And I when I was in college, I used to work at a college newspaper, and I know this story just like came out of nowhere, but it's related, I promise. The newspaper would drop at like midnight, is like when we would like send it to the presser. And so I was like I would always walk home by myself in like on the college campus pretty late at night, had to walk down the street with like a bunch of bars. So there was like always a lot of drunken guys. And as tends to happen when you're walking alone by yourself as a woman, where there are a lot of drunken men, there's like, I'd always get like cat calls when I was walking down the street. And when you ignore them, like when I ignored them, that's when the racial stuff starts coming out, where like people start saying racist things about you because you're not giving them the attention that they want. And I would always like go home and think I would always think like, do these people like, are they always thinking these racial slurs in their minds, or like is it just coming out because they're drunk? Like, I don't think that like being drunk makes you racist. I think that like you being drunk just makes you say and do things that you wouldn't otherwise do, because you have like more control of yourself. But those thoughts are always there, because like that stuff just doesn't come out of your mouth so easily if it wasn't like already in your mind when you're sober. So like I wanted to have that sort of experience play out on the page, and really have Annalie grapple with the fact that this is happening because those boys have these thoughts, like even when they're sober, and that them doing it while they're drunk is not like an excuse for them. Like being drunk doesn't make them suddenly bad people. Like they're just claiming that they just got drunk and therefore like they just did this and it was like not a big deal. I don't think that I think that she realizes at the end that that's not a thing that flies. So yeah.
Agreed, indeed. I would love to talk about the moment where the mum has a sudden shift, which is when Margaret says, the day that we had the argument, I was meant to be going to prom and his mum had invited me over. And there seems to be something that shifts in her mother's like way that she's been constructing it, where she's been talking about the idea of like it wouldn't work, like it just that it's not like it, our families wouldn't get on, like they wouldn't like you, we wouldn't like them, all this kind of stuff. And it seemed like there was this really significance in like, oh, this boy's mother invited my daughter around and wanted to like share something with them, and she offers to bring something to him. I'm really wondering about like whether that journey for their mum was there from the very beginning, like where kind of when you decided to include this kind of element of racism within their own family, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that this story is about all of the different shades of racism that we don't like necessarily think about or want to talk about. And that includes like racism within the Asian American community, within the East Asian American community, with respect to people who have darker skin colors. Because I think that if you ask any Chinese or East Asian person, they would be able to tell you that growing up, their parents probably made weird comments about like other people who had dark skin, like including Indian people. And it's a really ugly part of, like our immigrant communities. But I think that it's common, and it's something that Margaret has a really hard time dealing with in the book. So that arc always existed. I wanted Mama to be able to like learn and grow through the course of the novel, even though it's something that she was very like initially opposed to. I didn't want her to be like this stagnant character, even though sometimes like, I guess like in real life, sometimes people do just like not grow, but I wanted Mama to be able to like grow through the course of the story and make amends for the damage that she did, which she doesn't fully do by the end of the book, but I feel like she takes a step in the right direction. And I think that particular turning point is important. Not that I'm exonerating Mama for her prejudice against Rajiv's family, because like it does come from kind of like an ugly place, but there's some element to it of feeling like the other side is probably just going to like, it's not going to work out because like the other side, they're not going to treat my daughter well. And like there is a seed of that in terms of why she's opposed to it, her fear that like her daughter is going to not be accepted by the other family. And I just remember, so my husband is white and I'm Chinese. And when we first started dating, actually both of our parents were like, their parents are probably not going to like you, and your relationship is probably not going to go very far because like, like it just doesn't really work out. They're not going to want you, like you can date, but like you're not going to be able to get married. And we found out that both of our parents had said that to us. Like they were both scared that the other parents were going to be racist toward us in some way, and they both were fine with us my parents were fine with him, his parents were fine with me. Our parents like get along so well, they go on vacation without us now, and my parents-in-law are literally downstairs watching my child right now. So it's kind of like a funny story now in retrospect that people had, but like people otherize like people that they don't know all the time, and Mama has a little bit of that as well, which is like part of why she is afraid of Margaret and Rajiv getting together.
I was like literally my tiny little heart shattering into pieces, because I knew that we were going to find out about the breakup, right? Like I knew that we were waiting to get there, and their dynamic is so interesting because it's like, who was the one who broke up with who? Like he was just such a delight, and there didn't seem to be like an overwhelming bitterness we were going through. And just that like moment where we find out about the idea of like him waiting there in his little suit, like with all of this food, especially because food is such a like huge like expression of love, I guess, expression of like care and affection and expression of culture. And to have him just like waiting there, I was like, oh god, I knew it was gonna be something like this with my heart. But I love that we managed to like take it back around. I was really rooting for those crazy kids. I was like, oh, we'll put you in an office together, we'll see what happens by the end of the summer. We're almost at the end of time, actually. If anyone in the who's watching live has another question in the chat, please put it in there, because I want to make sure that you all get to ask your question, so it isn't just the Rowan show. However much, obviously, we love that once a month for the book club. I'll ask another question from Marija. I think we've got one last one from them, which is, from Dark Gust again. Do you have a dream project that you would like to work on? Is there something that you have always wanted to do? Or was this book the dream project?
Oh, it's a really good question. My dream project, so I've always wanted to write something speculative, like something that has like a little bit of an element of either sci-fi or like magic, not too much, but just like a very like high concept premise. I really like time travel. There has been so many time travel books that I feel like I could never do time travel justice. But one day I feel like I'm going to come up with a perfect premise that includes time travel that I will be able to write. It's never happened yet, but that's my dream project, is that I want to write something with like a little bit of that speculative twist.
Oh, I love that. I'm very big on like high concept time travel stuff. Sounds great
Yeah.
to me. So
I love like what if stuff, like just like
yes,
different times. Like I love that. The Time Traveler's Wife is one of my favorite books. I am
so
just
good.
a huge stereotype, but like I love that book. So
Oh my god, amazing. My final question is, how has the reception to the book been? Because you were saying that you've like talked to other book clubs and other readers and stuff like that already. What have you been hearing, and has it been kind of the response been what you've expected?
I think it's been good. You know, like one thing that I found really great about the reaction is that people are able to identify with those characters even if they're not Asian American. I've actually had like a lot of people be like, oh, you know, like I related to it because of, you know, feeling like I didn't fit in as a kid in one specific way, or like that I was not part of a community in some different non-racial way. I think that the fact that people could find some element of that story that they could personally identify with, even if it wasn't the racial stuff, has been really pleasantly surprising to me. I don't know why that is pleasantly surprising to me, because like I've been able to identify with all kinds of books growing up that like did not, like I didn't look or you know have a background like those characters at all. But I think that that's been great, because I don't want the book to be so narrowly tailored as to be like, oh, that book about, you know, race that only Asian people can read or whatever. Like I think it's like a story that just is like a coming of age, because I think that a lot of people have the kinds of feelings that the two sisters have, and that's been a really nice part of people's reaction so far.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been so much fun. It's gone absolutely sped past. And thank you everyone who has been watching at home. Just to let you all know that next month, as of 3 days time, not to panic you or anything, XiXi, but the 3 days until the month that your next book is due, we will be reading Our Crooked Hearts by Melissa Albert. I got up on my phone to triple check because I was like convinced I was going to accidentally do the wrong one. The 3 words to describe it we have are witches, friendship, secrets. Very spooky time, very Halloween. And in fact, we have one other book that has been announced, which is our November book before we like wrap up the year, which is With Fire in Their Blood, the Kat Delacourt book, which is supernatural, love square, love a good love square, dark academia. So two kind of more spooky vibes books to look forward to. So very excited to be wrapping up our final sort of like contemporary in the real world one with you. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Sounds perfect for the fall. I am excited to read those books as well.
Amazing. Okay, we will see you all next month.
Thanks, guys.